meet, and that's when we learned that there was a large number of gardens, community gardens, and many residents, particularly women, with a background in agriculture. That's what they were doing in the South or in their own countries. And we have a large number of young people looking for meaningful program for themselves. And we put together, community gardens, a large number of young people, people with history and tradition and expertise in agriculture. And that's how one of our largest program also is New York Farm, start in the 90s. In fact, let me introduce Gemma Garcia, the board president of UCC, who is also a gardener and the official beekeeper of United Community Centers. We have other programs. Immigration is another program in which we provide ESL classes, citizenship, and also immigration assistance. Right now, our advocacy and organizing efforts are around the rezoning or the effects of the rezoning in East New York. And I will talk a little bit later because I know that we are with time constraints. We are going to have a rally, not only residents and organizations in East New York, but we are organizing a rally on November 12th with other citywide organizations, pretty much to push for what we call it the Homeowners Bill of Rights. And also for keep pushing for affordable homes in the community where they're building new homes. But right now, today, we are here to talk about the census and the importance of the Census 2020, which start next April 1st, right? And we have invited James Tillmon from the New York, the U.S. Census Bureau, but the regional office. And with James, we know each other for so many years, also a resident of the community. And Amy Torres from the Chinese American Planning Council, who has been organizing people around the census and how to prepare, more important, how to prepare communities so we all are counted. And I will stop here and let me introduce Emily from Brooklyn for Peace.
Hi, I'm Emily. I'm Emily. I'm the program coordinator with Brooklyn for Peace. We're super happy to be here tonight in East New York with United Community Centers. I think this is our first event here, maybe like ever. Is that true? No, not ever. Not true. In my time, certainly. So yeah, Brooklyn for Peace has been organizing for peace with justice in Brooklyn since 1984. We're a democratically functioning, nonpartisan group. We are committed to eliminating war and the social injustices that are its causes. Through active education on international and domestic issues, we empower our community and ourselves to be a productive force in securing a peaceful future for generations to come. Just a quick note, this event is going to be videotaped, as you can see, so if there's an issue with that, just let us know. We can totally work around, make sure you're not on camera or whatever. I know James has a bit of a time crunch, so I do want to talk a bit about a campaign that we have, but I'll do that afterwards, about the Move the Money campaign. I'll do that afterwards before we start the Q&A. And just take one moment before we get started to acknowledge and honor that the land on which we gather here tonight is the seized and occupied territory of the Lenape peoples who stewarded this land for generations. We pay our respects to their elders past and present, and ask that we all take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us here today. Thank you. Okay, so James, take it away.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Anna forgot to tell everyone that 25 years ago, I was a part of with Mel Greiser, the executive director then, making sure that we were able to start off our farmers market. And I used to drive about 4 o'clock in the morning up to Hunts Point, get fruit and vegetables and bring them down. And that's how committed I was to the farmers market being in this area. So we have some history, a lot of history. But But my name is James Tillmon. I'm with the U.S. Department of Commerce Census Bureau, and I'm here to talk about just simply about the census. And really, you know, I was going to trust my computer for a second, but I said I'm not going to turn it on because I don't want it to explode on me. So you always carry your trusting piece of stuff that you can use from time to time. So I'm lucky this time. You know, the goal of the census is really, the mission is really to serve as the nation's leading provider of quality data about its people and its economy. That's simply it. Our purpose is to conduct a census of population of housing, disseminate the results to the President of the United States and the American people. Most people don't know that our first census director was Thomas Jefferson. So I just want to share that with everybody. The Census Bureau is really the largest statistical gathering agency in America. That's all we do. We just count people. You know, it's not complicated. We're the leading source of quality data about the nation's people, places, economy, and conducting more than 130 censuses throughout the nation. Some people call me and tell me, oh, James, I got my census form already. And I have to remind them, I say, remember, we do 130 different surveys. You may have gotten the American Community Survey. And I said, is it a book, almost, where it's asking a lot of questions? Then that's the American Community Survey. The census is only done every 10 years since 1790. Every 10 years. And all it says really is that we have to do one thing. We're mandated by Article 1 of Section 2 of our Constitution. It simply says to count everyone living in America. That's all it says in our Constitution. So that's what we do. We conduct it every 10 years. We count every resident living in the United States. You know, there's an increasing diverse population in America, and in the United States, and we understand that. In 2010, there was 330 people that were counted in the United States Census, with 140 million housing complexes. So we have to remember that. Your census will not come to you by your name. It will only come to you at your address or your apartment number at that address. It doesn't come to you by name at all right? So be prepared. Just answer that question. 10 questions. Takes you all of 5 minutes to do. But what I want to preference this conversation with is simply this. We have found out that children 5 and under were not counted in the 2010 census. So when you're looking at overcrowding in our schools, or when you're looking, there's not enough room in daycare centers to house these children, because we didn't count them. We had no idea that that was that many children that were undercounted. So we're going to sting into that to make sure that we do better this time. The responses is private and confidential. I can tell you until I'm blue in the face that it's private. People are scared for whatever reason, be it the immigration services or ISIS or whatever. We cannot share any of that information with any other agency in any state or federal government. You know, the other day I was at Pink Houses doing a presentation, and the woman got up and said, well, I got 15 people to live in my apartment with me. I have a 1-bedroom, but I'm on the lease. Should I count those other 10 or 15 people? And I said, of course. We're not going to share that with housing. We're not going to go to NYCHA and say, okay, Ms. Gonzalez has 15 people living in her apartment. We would be in violation of the Constitution. You know, if I were to tell anything about anybody, I take an oath. And the oath, and it's an oath that carries me throughout life. So I can be arrested anytime, you know. I take an oath that I will protect people's confidentiality. So if I share that information, I go to jail, a federal prison for 5 years, and I collect a $250,000 fine. I'm not interested in doing that. So we make sure that we protect everyone's privacy. It's critical. Our goal is simply this at a 2020 census, is to motivate people to be counted, to establish where to count, and then we count the population and we give that information to the President of the United States. No, we cannot give the President any specifics on any household. If the President says who lives at 615 New Lots Avenue, of course no one lives here, but we said, Mr. President, we can't share that with you. Because once we get that information, your name goes south, your address goes west, and any other information goes, you know, everywhere else, but it doesn't bring it together so that we can bring it together. So we couldn't tell that anyway. And we would be in violation if we did that. So we're not going to run that risk. The 2020 census is really safe. It's safe, it's 10 questions. What we're going to do uniquely this time is the people are going to be able to answer their census form by mail, by internet, by telephone, and by some annoying person knocking at your door because you didn't answer your census form. That's really the only 4 ways that we're going to do it this time. Now, we're paying people $25 an hour to work for us. We just opened our first office in Brooklyn on, I think it's on Myrtle Avenue on the corner of Lewis and Broadway. We just took over the Social Security building that was there, and we took over 2 other buildings that were there. But we have to staff those offices. We need people that are going to want to work with us and work for us. We need managers, we need supervisors, we need enumerators, great pay. I had a young woman that worked for me in 2010, and she's coming back because she said that she got paid very well. They didn't interrupt her Social Security benefits or her pension benefits, and she was happy. She enjoyed the work, and she got paid weekly and on time. So we have people that have done this in 2010, and they're going to come back and do it in 2020. You know, it's going to be simple. All they're asking you in the questionnaire, 10 questions. That's your name, your age, your date of birth, your race, origin, of course your address, and maybe a phone number at the end, so if there's a problem with that form, that we can call you and say, you may have missed a question, or how do you want to fill that question out? So that's the only reason we're asking for your phone number. But if someone comes to your doorsteps and asks you for your Social Security number, or asks you for your personal information, your banking information, they do not work for us. And there will be scams. They've already started. There will be scams, and people will do that. So be careful. When you get that form in the mail, immediately fill it out and send it back in. Because then we don't knock at your door. We don't bother you. The only time we come to people's doorsteps is when we haven't heard from you. And we'll give you 4 or 5 times. On March the 12th through the 20th, everyone in America will receive a general letter asking you, how would you like to complete your census form? You can answer it right then, or you can wait and say, I want to do it by phone, or I'd rather do it by internet, or I'd rather, do it by the census form itself. That's going to be your choice. We're going to hit you 3 to 4 times. On the 5th time, that's when we're going to send someone knocking at your door. So you're going to get a couple of chances to answer that form, and if you don't answer or respond, then we'll have to send people out. So the question is very simple. The internet is going to be very simple. Once you get you decide that you want to do it by internet, we'll send you a letter with the internet address that you can go on and do it. Every letter will have a code on it, so keep that letter, or make sure that you respond to us via that letter and that code. All right. So that's it. Another thing we're going to have already, there are 12 languages that non-English speaking languages that we're going to have available. And those languages are Portuguese, Polish, Chinese, Russian, Korean, Spanish, of course, Arabic, Vietnamese, French, Haitian Creole, and Japanese. But we're going to have another 59 languages that are going to be available. Now, I speak Bubi and I speak Fang. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in West Africa for 3 years. I speak those languages, but I know there are not many people that speak those languages. But if needed, I can translate. I also speak Spanish, believe it or not. I lived in a Spanish-speaking country in West Africa between Gabon and Cameroon for 3.5 years. So I know how to speak Spanish as well. But we're going to have people who are going to be able to speak those languages and speak to you in the language, in your mother tongue. You know for a fact that there are $675 billion. Some elected officials will say some other things, but there's $675 billion that will come down from the federal governments for communities that are counted. Brooklyn is the 3rd largest city in America, following Los Angeles, Chicago, then Brooklyn. Not New York City, Brooklyn. 2.8 million people live in Brooklyn. There is no reason why we shouldn't be counting ourselves, because that money would come to us if we are counting. 2.8 million, the largest borough in the city of New York. So we have to make sure that we get people out there to be counted and make sure that they understand the importance. But right after the census, the 2020 census, is what we call redistricting. That means all your congressional representatives are shifted. That means that we may lose a seat or 2. I think we lost 2 last census. And if we lose that seat, in 1950, I'm told, we had 45 congressional representatives representing the state of New York. Now it's 27. So you do the math, you think about it. The less people we have in Congress, that's not a good fit. You know, we need to have more. So we know that we're constrained by the environment. We know that there's a rapid and strong distrust of government. We understand that. There's a rapidly changing technology. That's why we're doing the census forms via internet. We know that there's declining response rates always. That's why we've added these 2 new ways, really 3, to do the census form. And we know there's an increasingly diverse population living in different living situations. So we understand all that, but we understand also that we have to be counted. And we also think of everyone in this room as trusted voices. I go to the faith-based communities throughout the district and throughout Brooklyn to talk about the importance of the census. If the pastor gives me, or the rabbi, or the imam gives me 5 minutes just to say, this is why it's important, this is why you gotta do it. There was an elected official that lived in Brownsville. I just want to tell you a short story. Her mother was 78 years old, and I spoke at her church. She had never done a census form in her entire life, nor her family. And she said, I'm gonna do my census form this time around. And I said, why? She said, because this is the first time someone told me what it's for. The purpose of it. I never understood the purpose of giving anybody my information. So I didn't know what it was for. And she said, for this, the first time in my life, my 78 years living, that I'm gonna do a census form. Because now I understand the purpose of it. So we want to get that message out. I always tell my friends that were rabbis, I said, before you go to the bar mitzvah, please give me 5 minutes so I can talk to the people who are there. Before they turn the music on at a block party, please let me come and talk about it real quickly. The tenant associations, I go to all tenant association, block association meetings, because I was born and raised in this community. I know this community very well, very well. So I say that give me 5 minutes to say something about the census, so after they're doing their dancing and they're finished, they'll say, wait a minute, wasn't that guy there talking about census? You know, and I need to do my census form. I just want to encourage them to do that. So we're looking at you as the trusted voices. This is an opportunity to come and talk about the census. Whether it's a big crowd or a small crowd is really irrelevant. It's that someone's going to get that message and share that message with their family and friends. So I hope that that's the case in this room. You know, we're partners with the Chinese American Planning Council. Did I say that right? Yes. And elected officials, colleges, universities, schools, libraries, government offices. There's not a library that we don't go to where they have adult, especially where they have adult education programs, that we're not speaking at and talking about the importance of the census. No, you don't have to be a U.S. citizen to apply for the job. I mean, to apply for the census form or do the census form. So that's one of the things that we try to get people not nervous about, you know. Just do your census form, 10 questions, it'll take you a couple of minutes. And I know that, another story I want to share with you, my son went to school at 165 in Brownsville. And one day I just threw the census form aside. I said, I'll do it later. And he said, because you didn't take the 2.5 minutes to complete a census form, that's why I don't have a music program in my school. Because you didn't take the 2.5 minutes to complete a census form, you've already defined my future. So what do you say to your kid when he says that? You get out and you pick up your pen and you fill your census form out. Because the children understand the importance of it. We have census in the schools as well. We're trying to get that message across that people can understand it and the importance of it. So once again, we're going to be working with all social media that we know. There's going to be a huge campaign beginning in January where you're going to see so much census stuff floating around that you're going to say, okay, I'm getting sick of it, you know. And we're going to have it on busway, you know, trains, buses, everywhere you can imagine. Every billboard, we're going to put it up. And yes, we're counting people in prisons. This is another thing I get a lot from, you know, parents who have children at a prison. They'd rather have their children counted at home. And I get that, but I said, that's an act of Congress. That has nothing to do with us. So a congressional representative would have to bring that legislation forward for it to change. We can't do that. We just have to count it. So we count them in what we call group quarters. So if they're in college, we count them in colleges. If they're in jail, we count them in jail. Some of these small towns really are aware, particularly where prisons are located, they know the importance of the census. And I want to tell you, I went to Northwell Hospital in Long Island to take a friend to the hospital, and it was the smoothest experience I have ever had with healthcare. clean, decent. You weren't waiting for hours to be seen by a doctor. And something struck in my head. I bet you these people do their census forms. And they do. They count it. They understand the importance of it. So we got to get to that point as well. Like I said, we're hiring online. If you know anyone needs work, we're looking for people starting at $25 an hour, and it goes up. So if you know someone that's looking for work, please let them know. Family, friends. We're hiring nationally. We're hiring close to 500,000 people nationally. But in New York, we're having a census campaign that's going to happen National Recruitment Day, which is on the 20th of October until the 26th of October. So if you're interested in doing that and hosting a census day where people can come and apply for the jobs online, where we're there to help them through the process in case they get stuck, that's going to happen through those months. So having said all that, that's my census presentation. Thank you so much. I hope you'll complete your census.
Thank you, James. I don't know if we want to open questions while you're still here, but if any folks have questions for James, and then I can dive in.
Yeah, I have one question. This paper says that completing the census is mandatory. So is there any penalty for not completing it? This sounds a little scary.
It's mandatory by our Constitution, but we don't force people to do it. You know, we haven't enacted any penalties or anything like that, but it is mandated. But you know, you can only suggest people complete it. We can't make you complete it, but it is in our Constitution.
Yeah. Regarding jobs, what's the length of employment on that? Or are there part-time jobs as well?
There's part-time and full-time, and the length is until the census is done.
And when does that begin?
It started already.
So
Yeah, we did what we call the canvassing, where we'll go around and check the addresses just to make sure they're all right. We're partners with the United States Postal Service, but there's a lot of developments going on in Brooklyn, and we have to really make sure those addresses are in our data, so that when we go and send those forms out to those apartments, we'll know where we're sending them to.
Question, I know that there are other groups, I mean, CUNY has been allocated a relevant amount of money that is going to be out through the form of an RFP. And you mentioned that the census is going to be online, by phone, they're going to be knocking your door, and that will be the census people.
Right.
But then you will have these other groups that also will try to do the apply. So how?
The only people that are constitutionally mandated to do the census is the U.S. Department of Commerce Census Bureau. Now you have partners such as, you know, our partners with the Chinese American Planning Council. We have partners with the mayor. First time ever a mayor has given $40 million in the whole history of the census to make sure that we get, you know, a decent count. That has nothing to do with us. We have no money to give away. We're just here to do the census. So we're appreciative towards the mayor and his people, but they are not the people who conduct the survey and conduct the census. We're the federal arm of the government. So it may be New York City Council and the mayor that got together and created this pot of money, as well as the governor, who created another pot of money of $20 million for the entire state. So that's their thing, to help advocate and promote the census, and we appreciate that. But no, we're the only ones that really do the work that's federally mandated. Oh, I'm sorry.
Do you count homeless people?
Yes, we do. And what we're going to do uniquely this time, I think the city goes out every year and checks places that people are usually at. I've been doing that for like the last 15 years. But we're going to do it on our own as well, along with the city, to make sure that we're finding people where they are. Because remember, we want to count you where you are. That's the goal. But yes, we do count, we do go out extra to make sure that we get an accurate count for people who are homeless. Because everybody's not in the shelter. You know, we know that. Some people on the platforms, train stations, some people are in the L line over Van Sinderen. There's a lot of places where people are camping out.
What about migrant workers? I mean, it's going to be April. And I'm thinking about, even not that we have migrant workers, but I'm thinking about the season and the planting season.
Right.
What about
They're
migrant?
going to be doing that as well. So in those states where they're doing that, like California or in the South, there will be groups that will be going out and working with them and counting and helping the count, do the count. We want to count everyone in America. That's the goal. So that's what we're going to act with it.
What about people whose mail comes to your house?
I'm sorry.
What about family members whose mail come to your house for them? Not for me, but for them.
So are you
Like,
saying
for
that they may be
instance,
homeless or something? Or?
My granddaughter, right, she lives someplace else,
Okay.
but her mail comes to my house.
Oh, okay. We're not looking, if she lives with you, that's a whole different story.
No, she
If her
doesn't.
mail comes to you, depending on where she's at, we're gonna count her where she's at.
Okay.
That's the goal, just to count her where she's at. Like I said, NYCHA, that's just an example. If someone's living in your household and you're the only one on the lease, and you have 10 cousins who have camped out there because they have no place to go, we're asking those people to count the people that live in that apartment. We can't share that information with NYCHA. Because some people get scared. They say, oh, you're going to run down to the management office and tell on us. You know, no, we can't do that. We can't do that by law. So I know a woman that owns a house where she's made all the rooms like a rooming house.
Yeah.
So I told her, so what you have to do now is that you have to be the head of household and you have to count all those people on your census form. It's not always a good thing for people to come knocking at your door. I really rather not, particularly seniors who may be living in Cypress Hills housing, and someone knocks at your door and you start giving your information in the hallway where everybody can hear your stuff. Or you're sitting in your stoop and somebody can hear all your stuff. It's like, no, do that form at home and we won't bother you. We really won't. Once you've done that form, you submitted that form, we're out of your hair for the next 10 years.
Those forms get mailed in?
They get mailed in. And we're partnering with senior centers, and what they're doing is, because they have a social work piece in their contract with the city, when it comes to DFTA, they are gonna help our older folks do their forms, and then they're gonna walk them to the post office to drop it in the post office. So you can't do your form for your dad. You know what I'm saying? You can't do it for him. If your dad,
He's not alive anymore.
right, but I mean, if he were alive, you know, that you can't do the form for him, you would have to help him with the form, and then you would mail it for him.
He has to sign?
But he has to
sign
put it in. No.
The question about the rooming house example.
Mhm.
That person is the head of household. They
Yeah.
list the number of people on their form. Those people don't fill out forms?
No. It goes to a house. For example, this is a multiple dwelling with I guess you would call them SROs or rooming
Yeah.
houses. But they would fill out that form for that particular, I think she has like 15 rooms that she rents out.
Right.
And she would fill the form out. She would be the head of household,
Right.
and she would put everybody under that.
Does she list their names?
Yes.
And one form is then submitted.
One form, yes.
And when you have a family of 5, parents and 3 kids, how many forms get filled out there? One.
If you live in one apartment,
Right.
or if you live in a 2-family home and your kids live downstairs, your kids get a separate form and you and your wife get a form
That's
separate
per household.
per household.
Interesting.
Anna?
So if you have, I mean, something that we see with some of our families is just one apartment and 3 families, 4 families in the same apartment.
Mhm.
Each family is going to be counted separately.
They're in the same
Someone,
apartment,
whoever
right?
is on the lease.
Whoever's on the, they don't even have to be on the lease. They
I
can
mean,
be just the head of
whoever-
household. And they would, you know, like sometime, I know in my family, you know, my grandfather would handle all that stuff. So we would help him fill out the form and then we would just mail it for him. But if we're living in the same apartment that he's in, then we're counted under him. But if we're living downstairs and he and my grandmother living upstairs, then they have 2 different forms.
In a separate apartment.
Separate apartment. Yes.
Not just upstairs and there.
Yes, I'm sorry, yeah, because that could be a 1-family home.
Yeah.
Yep. So anyone that was at, and you know, some conditions have been that we have basement apartments now. I think there was a plan, I think it's in operation now, where you can turn your basement into an apartment, and those people are counted separately from that one. You may live in Nehemiah Homes, which has, what, 3 bedrooms, 1.5 bath, and then they have a whole apartment downstairs, and they would have to be counted separately. Does that help everyone? Yeah. Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I almost feel like I don't need to go at all. But I would love to talk about some of the reactions that we heard in the Q&A and unpack some of the things that James shared about the importance of the census. But maybe before I do that, I can just introduce a little bit about who I am and the organization that I work with. Here we go. Almost there, yeah. So I work with an organization called CPC, Chinese American Planning Council, and we are a social services organization. We started in Chinatown in 1965 at the end of the Chinese exclusion years. Is anyone familiar with the Chinese Exclusion Act? Has anyone ever heard of that before? So this was after the railroads were built across the country. The railroad companies got what they wanted, the East Coast, the West Coast, they were finally connected. But there were a lot of freemen and a lot of Chinese migrant workers who were then out of a job. At the same time that the railroads got connected, the US underwent a recession, and there was a lot of economic anxiety about people of color, immigrants, taking jobs and not leaving enough jobs for the rest of America. So what happened was there was an act passed through Congress that became law called the Chinese Exclusion Act. This, in 1890s, prevented any Chinese from coming over and reuniting with their families in the United States unless they had a rigorous amount of paperwork. And this stayed in place until 1965. So CPC was formed in 1965 in direct response to the huge amount of Asian immigrants that were finally reuniting with generations of family that they had lost or who were seeking opportunity here. And the story that I heard was that someone had a grocery van that they sold. They bought a storefront, they put a sign outside, and they said, "We will enroll your kids in public school," because the public schools were not equipped to speak Chinese and get children into classes. So that's how CPC formed. Today we're the largest social services organization for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the country. We serve over 60,000 New Yorkers every year at 30 different sites throughout the city. And so we really look at opportunities like the census as a way for us to further promote our social and economic empowerment agenda and further the work that we do, and more importantly, further the visibility of the communities that we work with. So census is very important to us, and so James mentioned the article in our Constitution that mandates the census. This is what it looks like. So when someone asks you, what is the census? This is it. Which, when you tell that to like your mom or your brother or your sister or your friend, like no one wants to read this, and it is not that surprising that when people hear about census, they don't get excited when this is the kind of language that we use. But what census actually is, and thank you, Emily, because she's changing the slides, is exactly what James mentioned. It's a count of every household, it distributes federal dollars, and it determines our political representation. So every time you pay your taxes, all of those taxes go somewhere. We need to figure out where they go. The census helps determine that. So a 10-year count of the total population of the United States, because there's no other operation of this kind, the census is the largest peacetime operation that our country undertakes. So the only thing that is larger than the census is war, basically. So we really see this as an opportunity. There's so much resource and attention dedicated to the census. Let's use this as a path forward. And because it's so accurate, it is the source of data for many types of reports that come out, It's used in city and urban planning. It's used in basically anything that you can think of. Census data is used to plan and implement it. The distribution of federal funds, so over $800 billion of federal funds are sent back out to the states. We know that in New York State, in fiscal year 2017, New York overpaid the amount of taxes that we received back. So New York State contributed 24.1 billion taxes, more than we received back in federal funding. And how does federal funding get determined? It's all of the formulas that come out of the census. How many public schools do we need? Well, let's look at census data. How many hospitals do we need? How much should we dedicate for SNAP, for WIC, for public housing? You know, all of these programs follow a formula that is determined by census data. So if you have flawed census data, you have a flawed formula, that's a result that you have to live with for the next 10 years. And then our political representation. So there are 435 seats in Congress. We all know we get one president, we get 100 senators, and we get 435 congressional representatives. That changes every 10 years. So as James mentioned, the number has declined significantly. Since the year 1980, New York State has lost, I think, 8 total. 8 representatives in the House of Congress, that's the size of other states. So we've effectively lost a full state just from our population decline, and what some would say also because of an undercount. So why does the census matter? Let's talk a little bit about what's at stake. So for community-based organizations like us, or like you, or for folks that work at community-based organization, remember all that data and that planning that we talked about? It really hurts our work. How much community block grants can we apply for? How many after-school services is our city going to provide? These are all determined by census data. So if we have bad data, we've got bad results. Cities and counties, they need accurate planning also. So was anyone around during Hurricane Sandy? So you may remember there were a lot of emergency routes. There were a lot of folks on the ground trying to get food out to people who were isolated. There was a lot of planning that went on in an emergency response. How did they know where people were living? How did they know where resources should be spent first? The census. Everything from how hospitals plan where emergency vehicles go, how fire departments determine which is the fastest route to get from one place to another, it's all derived from census data. And then last is New York State. So a significant part of our state's budget is reliant on federal funding, but again, because the state cannot do a data collection operation like the census, they are using federal data to formulate their plans for their own funding. So what's at stake? $800 billion in federal funding that goes out to the states. Some people estimate that by 2021, that number could be as high as $1.3 trillion. So when we're filling out the census, we're really fighting for our piece of that $1.3 trillion pie. New York State in 2016 received $73 billion, but again, as I mentioned, we over-contribute from our tax base. And there's a variety of reasons for that. It's, you know, the types of taxes that we contribute, but it's also where do those federal funds go? And it's not a one-to-one. So if we contribute $2 in taxes, that doesn't mean we're gonna get $2 in federal funds back. That is determined by the census. And then our political representation. So this is a map of our House of Representatives. The different colored dots, I know they're hard to see, but they're different states. So the reason I include this is we know that so much of decision-making that affects our daily lives is determined by Congress. The House of Representatives, they're the ones who determine the budget. So when people are saying things like defund ICE, guess who gets to make that decision and guess who gets to draft that budget? It's the House of Representatives. When people are saying we need more money for SNAP, guess who's making those decisions? The House of Representatives. The problem with this is that the Constitution mandates that we need a number of representatives that are that represent the total population. So we have 435. It didn't always used to be that number. That number used to rise at every census. So there would be a census, all of the data would be collected, they'd take a look and they'd say, okay, you know, we need to add 5 more seats or we need to add 10 more seats.
It doesn't make sense that the number is going down. Even if they didn't do the census, we know that there are more people in America. So I don't fully get that. I mean, we know there are more people here.
Yes.
So how did the number get so small?
Yes.
I mean, is it really based on census?
Yes. So,
But we know there are more people.
and that is exactly why the census gets politicized as a tool, which I want to talk about, because when we are only reliant on one single source to determine this much money and power, the census is only 10 questions. But if you make the barriers to answering those 10 questions, or if you disincentivize people from thinking that those 10 questions are important, guess what? The people in power get to say, well, you didn't fill it out, so you don't count. Even if you're here, we know you're here, but we're not counting you for our purposes. And that is something that we are explicitly fighting against, and that these kinds of spaces where we're building on each other's knowledge, we are challenging that notion. So for our stake in Congress, just as a, sorry, thank you, Emily. One representative is supposed to equal an average of 747,000 Americans. That 1 to 747,000, that is the highest of any industrialized democracy. So we should actually have more than 435 people representing us, but it has not, they have not raised the number of representatives since 1911.
Who raises that? Who raises that?
Congress.
The House?
Yeah, so they would need to introduce legislation, both sides would need to agree, and they'd need to vote on it. That 435 number, by the time we get to 2021, which means we're living with Census 2020 results, that means it's been over 110 years since Congress grew in size. But our nationwide population has grown far beyond that. So the amount of people making decisions for you are making decisions for a larger and larger group. Not to mention that even across states, the variability is huge. So Montana has 1 representative in the House of Representatives. Rhode Island has 2. If you look at their population difference, Rhode Island was tipped just over the edge to qualify them for 2. So that means for everyone in Montana, their ratio in Congress is 1 congressperson to 1 million people. In Rhode Island, it's 1 to, I mean, I still think that number is huge, 520,000. But what does that mean in terms of the balance of power? That means you are a more valuable American or a better represented American in a state like Rhode Island than you are in states like Montana. And it's all because that cap is artificially set. The census is not going to fix that cap, but it makes every seat we lose so, so incredibly important.
Do you know what the figure is in New York?
I don't know. I'm sure it's easily searchable, and I'm happy to find out. So all of these things are at stake: our federal funding, our political representation, the accurate data that we need for reports. And it's exactly as you said, we know that there are more people living in the United States. We know there are people that get undercounted. We know that there are not always good practices to estimate. You know, if someone never fills out their form, if someone knocks on their door and they never answer, there are other administrative records that the Census Bureau can use. They can look at postal records and see, you know, it looks like someone's living there. They can ask around and see, hey, it looks like maybe a family's living here. But what happens is people do get undercounted. And when you get undercounted, you miss out on 10 years of resources, which means when it's time to count again, you're that much further behind. So if you think about an 8-year-old in 2020, their family's filling out the census. Let's say for whatever reason the whole family doesn't get counted, or they don't count that child because they think it's only for adults. Think about the things that that 8-year-old is going to need for the next 10 years before they turn 18. They're going to need to get from elementary school through to high school. Hopefully they're going to graduate high school. Think about all of the resources that they're going to need. What are their school programs going to look like? Are they going to be in an overcrowded classroom? If they're not a native English speaker, is there even going to be an English language learner program at their school? What do the roads look like, the bus that they take back and forth to school? Does their internet have the right broadband access for people living in that community? If they start working once they're in high school, are there going to be jobs in their communities? All of these things are determined by the census because there's no other tool that's this accurate. So everyone is using it. Businesses are using it to know, hey, where should we expand? Where should we hire? Cities are using it to determine infrastructure, our roads, our railways, our subways, everything. Companies are looking at it. Where should we put our industrial waste zones? Well, it looks like no one's living here. Maybe we can put it here. And I think we know, especially in communities like Brooklyn, is that there are a lot of communities across the city that have an overburdened share of transportation depots, of waste departments, of things that are not necessarily great to grow up next to. But when we're under-resourced and underrepresented in big data, we get an oversized share of all the not great stuff and an undersized share of all of the things that we actually deserve. So, if census is so easy, so safe, and so simple, is it also biased? Has anyone ever heard of the term gerrymandering? Could you explain? So, what gerrymandering is, it's named after someone whose last name started with, actually his name was Gary. Yeah. But basically it is a practice that describes, you have a set number of people, and depending on how you shuffle them or how you arrange them, you can maneuver so that you always win a politically drawn district. So we talked about Congress, the 435 seats. The way that changes is we start drawing districts around communities and around neighborhoods. So if we have 50 people, let's say we know that people from this community tend to vote red, people from that community tend to vote blue. If we were to draw these same 50 people in a variety of ways, the most logical is down and across, right? Or keeping folks together. But what gerrymandering does is it intentionally splits groups up. So regardless of who actually has the majority in one area, there's no way for them to ever possibly win because you've been drawn in a way that's unfair. It's like starting a race and your starting point is like 10 steps behind. So gerrymandering is this practice which for a very long time was protected under our Constitution, but as of June this year, a lot of those protections were eroded, and the Supreme Court ruled that you cannot discriminate against people based on race, based on language, but you can politically draw districts, and that's still legal. So there's a lot of concern that if we mess with the census or make it harder for some groups to respond, those groups will be undercounted. If they're undercounted, they're easier to divide. If they're easier to divide, it's easier to draw the district we want, and then it's easier to make sure that that group does not have a political voice or has no political power for the next 10 years. And as we talked about in the example of using the 8-year-old child, 10 years, yes, it's a fixed point in time, but 10 years over the course of a lifetime can make or break a community. 10 years in the life of a youth, that can really shape how they turn out to be an adult. When we talk about 10 years in the life of a senior, you know, how is that person going to be able to afford retirement? Are they going to have the resources and supports that they need? So gerrymandering is a huge concern. These are some examples of gerrymandered districts across the nation. We have an example of I think this was an assembly district in Brooklyn. But basically you can see how Sunset Park maybe doesn't have so much in common with Brownsville, like maybe a little bit in common, but not like that much. But you can see that this district was drawn because there were voters in this part that vote similarly to voters in that part. So we just need this one skinny part to connect them so that I always win if my district is drawn that way. So, is the census biased? On the face of it, no. It's 10 questions. But the process by which the census is implemented, or the way that it's planned for, can create bias. It can make it harder for some folks to respond. So what's new in Census 2020? We know that the citizenship question received a lot of media attention. We're so happy that it is no longer on the census form. Even though we know that census data is protected, when we talk about the newest Americans, folks who maybe never took a census before because they've just moved to this country 5 years ago, when you add that and all of the fears and anxieties that are coming out of the federal administration, not to mention communities of color that are already over-surveilled and over-policed, adding a question like that is just like throwing a sledgehammer at all of the hopes and dreams that we want out of the census, which is that it's very important that you are counted so you get the resources that you need. It's removed, hooray. In a lot of ways, the damage is already done. CPC, because we serve a large Asian American community, we did a reading of all of the major newspapers. There were only 3 articles about the removal of the citizenship question. So unless you're really paying attention, you may be operating under the assumption that it's still there. Another important change is that there has been a lot of advocacy to change the way that questions are added or are phrased on the census. So there's a change in how you are able to identify an unmarried partner or spouse. And importantly, there's also a gender binary on the census form. So folks that do not identify as one gender or another would either need to write over it, which could invalidate their response, or choose something that doesn't necessarily represent their identity. And then the other, in terms of questions, is there's some national origin changes for additional races. So the Asian American community, the origin countries that Asian Americans come from speak over 40 languages. And then within those languages, countless other dialects. So normally when you ask someone, are you Asian American, they may not necessarily identify with that, but they may identify with being Vietnamese, or they may identify with being Filipino. So with some successful advocacy and policy making, Asian Americans were able to disaggregate their census questions. So now you can choose, I'm, Chinese, or I'm Taiwanese, or I'm Japanese on your census form. That's a huge win for us because we have very clear information about different parts of our community. That hasn't yet happened for other communities. So there's a really great group here in Brooklyn doing something called the Nick Black campaign, because a lot of people, the Check Black campaign. NYC Black, Nick Black, Check Black. So yeah, but I would be happy to share. Yeah, so Medgar Evers College School of Law and Social Justice, they have a campaign to talk through how folks from the African diaspora experience the word Black and how they identify with the word Black. So we know that Afro-Latin and Afro-Caribbean communities have different ways of how they self-identify. And by having these very rigid answers on the census could deter someone from identifying with that question and potentially not filling it out. Not filling out one question is better than not filling out full stop, but remember, this is the most accurate data that we have about all of our communities. So if we don't know what communities are living where and what resources they need, we can't really tailor supports for those communities either. There are also some digital changes. I think the most important that I'll mention is, as James mentioned, this is the first digital forward census. So folks can, after they receive their postcard, they can fill it out online. We know, again, that a lot of communities in New York City experience a low share of broadband access, so filling it out online is not always an option. Digital literacy is also a huge concern. And digital security is an even greater concern because maybe there's a pop-up shop in your neighborhood that's going to offer census self-response, but if they don't have their antivirus software up to date, or if they're not using the best security practices, it's kind of like going to an ATM. You know, once you have your card in the ATM, everything is safe. Once you've logged on to the Census Bureau site, everything is safe, but that doesn't guarantee that to and from the bank, something isn't going to happen to your wallet, right? So we want to think about digital security the same way. And the optional phone response is great again, but for New Yorkers who are not literate either in English or in their own native languages, you still many times over the phone have to spell out what you're responding to on the form, which can be challenging for someone who can't read or can't write or can't spell. And then funding, so this is a little out of date. Year after year, the census budget grew because the population grew. The changes in the population and the needs of the population grew. The Federal Bureau decided that all of these changes in the digital census are going to make it so much easier and such a huge cost-saving measure that they're going to keep federal funding more or less the same. There's been some changes, I think, since we made this slide, but effectively what that means is the most expensive part of the census, which is the door-to-door knocking and the field canvassing that James described, that most important part of the census may be underfunded, which means if I am a limited English proficient senior who can't use my computer, can't use my phone for whatever reason, if I don't respond to all of those mailers and all of those notices, there may not be enough money for a census worker to go knock on my door and help me fill out the form. Or maybe someone knocks the first time, but funding has run out by the time they're knocking the second or third time. So that leads us to solutions. What is New York Counts 2020? We are a coalition across the state of community-based organizations and individuals. We act as a clearinghouse. You can change it to this, thank you. We act as a clearinghouse for all census toolkits, materials, presentations like this, webinars, anything that you would want to do if you want to host an event in your community. That might be something like this, or it might be something like James mentioned, at a block party, you want to hand out flyers. We have that information for you. You can also sign up for our listserv, so if there are other events happening, you can stay tuned and hear about them. And then there's also an opportunity to develop sort of culturally relevant and accessible materials, because we know not every community is the same, which means not every message reaches people the same ways. So again, securing funding at the local and state level, this is something that we faced earlier in the year. We're really, really excited that both the city, which is just incredible the amount of money that they've invested, but that the state too has invested a significant amount of money to fill that federal funding gap. But we're also concerned about making sure our technology and the technology of partners is working, making sure everyone is counted and that concerns are adequately addressed, that we're building civic literacy and census familiarity. So I really loved the story that James shared about the grandmother who said, I would have filled it out if someone just told me how important it was. So having conversations like that to really empower people to get counted. And then lastly is making sure that there's enough upstate support. So we know there's a lot of resources here in the city that don't necessarily exist in other parts of the state, frankly, that don't even exist within some boroughs in the city. So making sure that we're serving as that convener, so that if you develop a really cool tool, or you have we had someone develop like census memes, like if you have a really cool thing for social media, that someone else can use it. All right, so maybe the next few I might skip because it's just more of the same. But yeah, so if you want to get involved with New York Counts 2020, you can follow us, you can use this address to sign up. And then if you want to apply for census funding, you have the opportunity to do it. So if you're a small business owner, if you are a local community-based organization, there's, I think it's $14 million that the city has put forward for you to do your own census work. And you know your neighborhoods, you know your communities best, so you can propose what that looks like for you. It could be anything. I mean, the community garden, you could have like seed packets that say like, grow your future, fill out the census, and like you pass them out because you know that that resonates with folks that you already have touch with. You could do events at senior centers, you can do events at after school sites. But the deadline has been extended to Wednesday next week, so I'd really encourage you, even if you don't want to apply, to take a look and think about it. There's no harm in applying. It's a fairly simple form. And then if you get some money to do great work, then yay. So I guess after this, I'll just open for questions.
One question that I had was, on this paper it says $675 billion of federal funds that get distributed. You said $800 billion. What's that discrepancy about?
Our standard is $675 billion, and that's what we're going from. Elected officials and others are putting a higher price on it. I'm just telling you what we know, $675 billion.
Also, are there any income-specific questions on the census? How do you know where lower-income communities live? You said that they use the census for all kinds of things. You always see per capita income in such and such neighborhood. Where does that come from?
Remember, we have 130 other surveys that take place. So the American Community Survey will give us a rendering of that. But the census is really just the census is done every 10 years. 10 simple questions. Get in and get out of your face. So
What are the 10 questions?
The 10 questions: your name, date of birth, address. Trying to remember them all, but language,
identity, race.
Yeah. What I will do though is that when the questionnaire is presented, we will bring it back to this group so that you can see the questionnaire more blown up, so you'll have an idea what you're going to be answering. Oh, here it is. Okay, name, date of birth, age, race and origin, Hispanic origin, relationship, gender, tenure, operational questions, which is pop name, your phone number, that kind of thing. They all have it. I'm sorry? Nope.
And do those 10?
Yep. I call them non-invasive questions.
Do those 10 have to be answered for each person in your household?
Yeah.
And there's space on the form for that?
Yes.
Years ago, there used to be 2 different questionnaires. There was a simple one, like the one you're talking about, and then a certain percentage of people were randomly selected to get a long form.
That's the American Community Survey.
I see.
One out of every 6 people that live in America answers that.
And is that part of this current census?
Yeah, that survey is going on now as we said. So yeah, but the decennial is the critical one that we're doing for 2020.
And importantly, that long form version, the American Community Survey, while it provides a deeper look at some of the income and other demographic data that we mentioned, it is not used in the calculation of the federal fund formulas or our representation. So it's really critical that we're getting communities to always respond to the census and understand which one is really affecting their They all affect your future.
So would somebody get two? They get the 10 question census and the long form?
No,
No.
right now, they're getting the American Community Survey, and that'll be over before the decennial starts, wait, like months, if it's not over yet.
And if you get a form in the mail and you're not sure what it is, you can go onto the Census Bureau site. There's a tab that says, "Am I in an active survey?" which will show you, like, yes, your neighborhood or your community is being actively surveyed. So that way, if you have questions or you're like, I thought I responded already, you can just double check and see, you know, whether you should fill it out.
And there's also a number attached to that survey that you can call. You know, everyone's not computer.
But what I meant is if you got this survey, you will still get census questions.
Oh, yeah, the decennial question, yeah.
Besides the mayor, you mentioned the mayor donated like 40. Right. So besides the mayor, are there any other person or groups which funded what you're doing right now?
Yeah, so a few of the borough presidents have formed what are called complete count committees. So these are places where you can receive information directly from the Bureau. A few of the borough presidents have attached money to it. I don't think Brooklyn has yet. I know Queens put out a pot, Manhattan did. Maybe, I really hope that Brooklyn will. I'm not sure if they will. But this is a great resource. This, not Homer Simpson, the other one.
There's New York, but I'm talking in general in the country. Like, who's
so
finance? Are you receiving any finance from any group, like guys like Bill Gates and stuff like
so there have been a few states have also invested money. Pennsylvania invested a lot, California invested a lot, and then private philanthropy, like you mentioned, are also contributing to something that they call the Census Equity Fund. So rather than, Bill Gates doing a whole bunch and then someone else doing a whole bunch, what they all said is, we're going to commit this much to census into this one body, and then that body is going to determine it. So if that's something that you're interested in, private philanthropy, if you get in touch through New York Counts 2020, you can figure out how to apply for private foundation funding also. Yeah.
We don't have any money, the federal government. So this is not us. We just put out the forms and we get you to answer those forms.
Going back to that 10 questions. So you mentioned that one of the questions is about race. Is that something that you...
Did I say race?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry.
Did you say that race? Because it's about that.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
So my question is, if that question is included, is that self-identify? You're going to have options. You can multiple options. How people will.
Right.
So race is there.
Yeah.
No. So you have multiple choices. You can choose more than one. You self-identify. How? What options people have?
You can choose more than one. That's why I'd rather have the form so you can all see it in person. But yes, you may be, Black Latina, so there may be an option where you can add that into that.
And the reason I'm asking this is because we also support people when they apply for their citizenship, which is a similar question. And unfortunately, in that form, they only talk about Latinos, and I'm sure that there are so many different groups, but in this case, Latinos might have that option to identify themselves within that ethnicity, which is even questionable. But when it comes to race, I always face, and I'm talking with someone who is willing to stay an hour or even 2 hours filling out that form, and it's very hard for many individuals to even decide for multiple races. And we always start in these, philosophical discussions about race and ethnicity and what really means. But I was curious about.
I think there's no clear way, and so many of us come through like waves of different diasporas, and like there's no clean way to self-identify, but like then let's use this as an organizing tool. Let's talk about like systems of oppression. Let's talk about like how we have racial discrimination and bias like very firmly entrenched within things like this. And there have been examples of groups successfully organizing to disaggregate and refine that data. So the more that we're having these conversations with each other, the higher we're able to elevate that argument. And then I also wanted to, actually, James, maybe you may know this a little better than I do, but I think sometimes people are very fearful about filling out the census all the way through, and especially someone who doesn't have past experience with census cycles, but in 1986, there was a huge backlog, similar to, now it's just at historic levels of high, but there was a backlog in immigration cases that the U.S. decided that they were going to have an amnesty and forgiveness program where they would let people become citizens even if they weren't on the right path or they didn't have all the paper. And one of the ways that they could prove residency in this country was through the census.
Yes.
And that is a really powerful message for folks that even are living here without status, is that it is so safe and secure that it can actually help you years from now. And we have instances in recent living memory of that being the case. No, yeah. Yeah.
So the data is important. I hope everyone does the census form. 40, 50 years later.
So the questions are going to be out.
They're going to be out on March the 12th.
Because I think that, at least for us, I'm thinking that with our parents, with our students in the ESL, with our students in Citizens or our gardeners, I think that to get familiarized with the questions,
Right.
even to discuss, I think it can be a good learning, educational material with their families. So when the time comes,
Right.
you're already kind of prepared. But also to go back to something that goes back, that to emphasize that the citizenship question has been removed, because I agree with you, damage has been done. And that is something that we constantly remind residents, that question has been removed, that question has been removed. But I agree also that, there's a level of damage.
Yeah.
And I think that the counter message that's helpful is that there have been a lot of attempts to influence and meddle with the census, and the courts have upheld that many of those instances are unconstitutional. That is something that we need to preserve, and the only way that we can preserve it is that states that have immigrant communities, that have communities that are disproportionately affected by these policies, have full representation. The law as it stands now fully protects and silos census information. The only way laws can change is if lawmakers change it. If we don't have enough lawmakers representing us, they can have more lawmakers representing them who can change and influence our laws. And that's something that we absolutely don't want to happen, which is why it's like a snake eating itself. Fill out the census survey stays to see if it gets better.
On this community survey, is the citizen question also eliminated from the community survey? It's in the community survey.
To be honest with you, I don't know what's in the community survey. I haven't seen it in the last 20 years. So if you got one, that's the only way. Did anyone get the American Community Survey yet? It's like a book.
Yeah, this is from the Daily News. Somebody wrote in and said they got in the form, they thought it was from the Census Bureau, so it seemed kind of official to them, and asked many questions, including when do you leave the house in the morning? And they kind of wondered, should they fill this out? And it seemed like it was an official part of the census.
Yeah.
So it's very, I think,
One of every
confusing to
6
people.
that live in America, that's a sample. One every 6. I don't know if that question is in there. I really don't. Because my focus has only been decennial. That's it.
You can
But you can look it up.
Yeah, you can go onto the Bureau's site, and you can even see old forms that have been used. So when it comes to like the different racial categories that the form is asking for, you can see what they've proposed as recent as March, February last year.
Last year.
So that version that's on there, what they last proposed still includes a citizenship question, but just remember, they haven't finalized the form. And a lot of that, and so you can look at the American Community Survey too, and find that on there also.
And that's why it's taking so long to put the form out, because after the Supreme Court made its decision, we had to print up over 2 billion pieces of literature around the questionnaire itself. So we're not even anywhere near completing the printout of all of the decennial questionnaires that will go out. So it's a lot. It's a lot. But it's not there anymore. So we couldn't do it until after the Supreme Court made its decision. Normally we start printing, and this is probably not important information. We start printing like a year and a half before, because we know we'll meet the schedule. But we just started once that decision was made. I think that was made in August or something, or
Yeah, initially in June and then mid-July.
Yeah.
Gave up.
So that's when we started doing our printing, once that was finalized.
Any other questions?
If someone has their post office box, do they get them out of the post office box? They'll get their form at that post office box?
We're sending directly to the address. We're not sending it to you. We're sending it to the address, the location. 390 Pennsylvania Avenue, apartment 1A. That's where we're sending it to. So if you have a post office box, I probably would believe that it'll probably go to your post office box. But we're going to send it to that address. I don't know.
And you need that code number, must go on the census form.
It'll already be on the form. Once you send it back to us on May 12th to the 20th, and it'll have that code number on it, which will tell us who you are, what apartment number you're in, what address you're at.
So somebody cannot get a form, fill it out, and send it in?
No.
Absolutely not.
No.
Has to be
There's
called.
not going to be a bunch of forms sitting in the Chinese Planning Council.
Right.
No. People will have to bring their individual forms if they want assistance for, seniors, for example, to help someone can help them fill out the form, and it has to be mailed. So we partnered with all of our senior centers, particularly in Brooklyn, to make sure that there's someone there to help people, particularly. And we also have the program Schools in the Census, and I think you mentioned earlier about the age. 5 and under has been, in 2010, we didn't get the numbers that we thought we would get. And also, black men between the ages of 18 and 29 were not counted in 2010. I won't say they weren't counted, they just weren't counted the way we hoped they would be counted. So, we have particular demographics we have to work with as well.
I think I read in the past that there was some algorithm or some formula for calculating the undercount, and there was controversy around that. So whatever you actually count, there were different formulas for different areas that they thought, I'll just make up a number, it was generally a 5% undercount or a 7% undercount. Is that still in effect?
So there's some like cleaning and refining that the Bureau needs to do, because there's, I can write my age or I can do whatever, and then if my handwriting is sloppy, it may not be worth them coming to my house to say, like, what did you actually mean to write? So they can use other administrative records to sort of fill in the gaps for either singular questions that are missing or people who just didn't respond full stop. And I think when it comes to that cleaning, that's when you really start missing children 0 to 5, because you ask a neighbor, hey, does anyone live in this house? Well, it's not like children 0 to 5 are like the most active members of their community, so people don't know that there's actually 3 toddlers living in this building. So I think, where was I? I don't know. So there are ways to estimate what the undercount is, and New York City actually sued in 2010 to challenge the results because they felt there was such a significant undercount. They lost that lawsuit. But we know there are way more people than show up.
I'm going to make a statement instead of a question. I just think that that question of the Constitution, of the citizenship, was an attempt to suppress obviously, to suppress participation by scaring people. But there's a much bigger question, and that is the whole atmosphere created by the Trump administration and their, attitudes towards refugees and immigrants that has a huge effect on scaring people from participating, filling out anything that goes back to the federal government. Despite what you say, that fear is very real. So it becomes very important for us as activists, as socially aware members of our community, to really have some sort of an action plan to take what was said here tonight in terms of why it's so important for communities to get full participation, to explain that to people in a very simple, straightforward manner. This is about funding our schools. This is about daycare centers in our community. This is about fixing our roads and having decent sanitation and so on and so forth, because all of that comes back to the city in terms of the $800 billion in federal funds, and we don't get that money unless we're counted. So I think Brooklyn for Peace, UCC, anybody else here who's a member of a church or whatever has to speak up and try to explain that to people, that it's so very important that this census be filled out by as many people as possible, and that it's a good thing, not a bad thing, and nothing to be scared of. That's all. We got a job to do.
That was, James, a good way to close our gathering today. Thank you for coming. I know it was challenging with this weather.
Not if you're a dog.
Not if you're
But for people, yes.
But I think that you're right. I think that now is not only on the Census Bureau, it's Chinese Planning American, it's for all of us to have an active role in our communities, however we define communities, however we define our immediate environment. I think that we have that responsibility for our children, but also for ourselves, and to create a path for those changes that we are hoping comes soon. So, thank you so much for coming.